The following presentation is a production of Ride the Wave Media.
Dressed the most outlandish of the crew, wearing these like fluorescent pink flying pianos, and we set apocalypse verses from the Bible to rap music with our like one African American guy that we had was our teacher, and it was like to help us memorize it better. And then of course all of the child exploitation got brought in, and they're like, now we're filming this and sending it out to the world.
This is so they filmed this as a like on purpose as like an advertisement.
Yeah, well, so the Children of God went from being a prostitution ring to a child exploitation, childhood entertainment, and performance ring. And they have the best whitewash story of all time, except for the Mormons. Because in the 80s, it was like harem photo, prophet, young women, in Time magazine, sex cult. And then they performed twice at the George Bush White House, H.W. Bush White House in the 90s.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, my sister was one of them.
That is pretty great, and also not as good as the Mormons, because the Mormons perform at the White House all the time.
Yeah, the Mormons definitely have the best whitewash story of all time. I just found out that y'all have more money. Sorry, your ex cult has more money than the Catholic Church, and I am just flabbergasted.
I actually claim that's my cult, actually. I don't know if we've talked about this or not, but I tell everyone that I am the true Mormon prophet. They've usurped my throne. All of that money is actually mine. So it is my cult.
Same.
And
I call Children of God my cult, but I don't think they have.
Yeah, we should be in charge. It would be great.
So I ever since I was 1 year old, right? I was like this child actress, little like Apocalypse Lindsay Lohan. And, you know, the cover of my book is me dressed as a soldier of love in the army of God in this like tinfoil armor. And I'm 2
you look
years
great.
old. Yeah.
You're 2 years old in this picture, and you are ready to fight the devil, which is all of us.
I say, like, when I say in the book, I was born a soldier, I'm being literal.
I also am too, right? Like I don't think that people quite understand. Sometimes they think I'm joking, but I was literally raised to be a warrior, like to go out and be ready for the apocalypse to happen. And it was going to be incredibly violent. And I was going to be fighting with the full might of God. And that's left some holes in my life, because I now all I can really do is play Fortnite. And that doesn't quite scratch the itch.
I mean, it's because we were raised to die, right? Like in our most formative years, we were told that we were not going to be around today. And we are, you know, and it has all of these effects in our lives. Like we tend to be really bad sometimes at future planning, at financial planning, you know, or about making deep long-term relationships. You know, you have your cult relationships, which is like you jump in with both feet and then, you know, people will move on. At least in my cult, we moved all the time. And then in the army as well.
You've like diagnosed me spot on. Here I am. They exactly described me. I call it. So I didn't expect to live past 25 until I was probably like 23. And
25
so I
is
call
the
that
magic number that they use. Children of God use 25 also.
Did it really?
Well, so Children of God, it comes out of evangelicalism, but he was heavily, heavily influenced by Mormonism. So it actually took me years of just being like, I have so much in common with Mormons, like ex-Mormons, you know, of all the ex-cults. That's also because purity culture is just the flip side of pedophilia culture. And, you know, the Children of God was
right. Yeah. I mean, and I'm so glad we have that in common. Oh my God. I'm so thrilled.
All in the comedy special. Like
it's all coming out.
I'm so can we laugh about this stuff?
And, you know, the good news is that there's a lot of us out here. So you guys, welcome to Vibing the Apocalypse. I'm your host, the Fresh King Benjamin, the one and only true prophet of Mormonism. And with me today, I'm very, very excited. I have someone I've followed on TikTok for a long time. You may know her. Her name is Daniella Young, the author of Uncultured, which she sent me I have a signed copy of this book. I'm so excited. Daniella, do you want to introduce yourself and just tell maybe those who don't know you a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. I am Daniella, scholar of cults, extreme groups, and extremely bad leadership. I'm also known as Group Behavior Gal on TikTok and Knitting Cult Lady on YouTube. And also Group Behavior Gal on Instagram, where Fresh King Benjamin, just so you know, many of my followers are very excited for this show. So we're going to have to tell them all about it. So I grew up in the Children of God. I grew up in the Children of God, which is called a sex cult and truly was, in my opinion. And then I got out when I was 15, got myself an education and put myself into the U.S. Army. And Uncultured, I wrote while I was watching a cult leader run America and also getting a degree from Harvard in organizational psychology and looking at groups and what they mean. And a lot of what I do now, I mean, I'm writing another book called The Culting of America, which is really like teaching people about cults and what they are. And that is because a lot of what I do is go on social media and just tell stories about real cult stuff, because I feel like all Americans think they know what a cult is. That's why they think it's a niche thing. But it's really not, right? America is very cult-like, and so many of our organizations are very cult-like. And so, yeah, I call myself the anti-organizational psychologist, because organizational psychologists study essentially motivation tactics and then, you know, no shame, I guess, but sell our services to corporate America to then get more labor out of you for their good cults, in quotes. And so I just want to spend my life like helping individuals understand groups and systems better, because we're living through the culting of America.
And that's actually what connected us. Is I made a video on TikTok where I was just like, y'all, I think that America might be a cult. Like I've left Mormonism. Mormonism is definitely a cult. And when I look at America, there are a lot of similarities, and which isn't I've been, the cult word has been one that has been really empowering for me. I didn't use that when I first left, but the more that I learned about what a cult was and understanding it as like a diagnostic tool, that I'm not being pejorative when I call something a cult. I'm not like name calling. I'm trying to describe like a unique, very specific thing that word is intended to use. And so maybe that's where I'd like to start with you is, how would you define a cult? Like what are the characteristics? What are we saying when we're calling something a cult?
Yeah. So one of my just sort of easy to understand heuristic explanations for people is we're trying to describe coercive control, right? When a person comes under the coercive control of another individual, we call that a abusive relationship. But in cult studies, we call that a 1-1 cult. When a person, often children, are being brought up under an abusive person, narcissistic person with an enabler parent, often, right? We call that a like single family cult. Usually comes along with a circle of trust. And then when a person comes under the coercive control of a group, right? That's a cult. And I have it broken down into 10 steps, which I can explain pretty easily. So it's charismatic leader, often with a skinny white woman by their side. It is a worldview shift to come under the sacred assumption. So people think religion, but it's not always religion, but it is a worldview shift, right? You can have a karate cult. It is going to be still as much of a worldview shift as being recruited into Mormonism. And then the sacred assumption, this is the one thing like you have to believe, which for you guys is probably that David, what's his name? Joseph Smith was the one true prophet.
Joseph Smith. Yeah. That would be the one thing.
David Berg.
Yeah.
And
it's always, the one thing is always that one dude is the prophet. That's always it, is I am the source. And I guess that is because that's the source of the coercive control. I get to be in charge because God is talking to me and only to me. So listen to what I say and do what I say.
Mm-hmm. And let me sleep with your wives.
And let me sleep with all of your wives immediately, because that's what God really
we
wants.
always eventually get there. Okay, so then the step 3 is a transcendent mission. And I just wrote this chapter and I write heavily about Mormonism. And, you know, this mission that's just so big and so grand that, and also like unachievable because it's very unspecific usually. And oftentimes it's only achievable in the next life, right? In like a religious cult. But this mission is so right that it requires the self-sacrifice of members. And that's step 4, like the constant self-sacrifice and sublimation of the members. Step 5 is isolation. This can be done now with technology and AI in completely different ways. Step 6
that's
is
fascinating. Can we just pause there for just a minute? Because that step from mission to sacrifice to isolation, to me, perfectly describes my family and what because we were in. There's so many different layers of Mormonism as a cult, right? There's not just the LDS core. There's all of these like little sub mini cults all within it, right? So my parents, they grow up LDS in sort of what I call it like the diet cult. It's like a little bit lighter. It's not quite as intense, but they grow up in there, and then they fall prey to this transcendent mission of perpetuating what they call the higher laws, which are like polygamy and racism is really it. It's like be polygamist and be racist. And that is so important that they're willing to sacrifice. Like they live in shitty houses in the middle. They've moved outside of the world. They're in trailers. Sometimes they don't have electricity. Sometimes their water's fucked up. I grew up drinking yellow water because that was the well water that we had. And it was all sort of couched in this frame of we're doing this for God. All of this suffering is okay. In fact, it's transcendent because it's happening for this amazing purpose. And then the result of that, even he hates it. That's what I feel too.
Yeah. And you know, this willingness of the cult member, right, to sacrifice, to put everything above everything else in their life, right? This is a defining feature. And this is one of the issues I take with the AA cult, right? Alcoholics Anonymous. There's, even if we go with your it's a disease concept, AAers, there's no other illness in the world that we would just think it's okay to just put completely ahead of everything else, your children, blah, blah, blah. Like you could have stage 4 cancer. You don't just get to ignore your children until you know, but in AA cult, it like gives them the right to believe that their mission is more important than anything else. And that, by the way, the self-sacrifice, when we get to step 8, is exploitation of labor. And those two, I feel, are always tied together.
Of course it is. Of course it is, because that's ultimately what you're doing. It's you're getting people to do shit for you.
Yep.
So we were at isolation. Isolation is step 7.
So hang on. So cults are all about labor. This is Dr. Janja Lalich's saying, and it changed my life. Like that's when I realized we were a giant child exploitation cult, and I'd been trafficked around the world. And I think that it's because labor is your ultimate inexhaustible resource, right? Once you've taken everything else, their money, their land, their children, their bodies, everything else, like you can still take labor. Okay, so we were on step 7. So after isolation, then comes us versus them mentality. And this is really important. I'm going to bring up Swifties here, because a cult is not just being for something, it's being against something. Remember you said higher laws and racism, right? And so when people are like, are the Swifties a cult? I'm like, well, overall, nobody's even convinced me that we're a group. But when Swifties made a coordinated effort to go attack Jake Gyllenhaal, that's when you started really hearing talk of like, oh, is this a cult? Right. So that's the us versus them mentality. And we see it everywhere, and we encourage it in commerce and schools and, and then this is like my final stage of like, you're now a big, big cult. Also, sometimes you're nearing your end game. But for the Mormons, they've just stayed in step 8 for a very, very long time, I think, which is exploitation of labor. Exploitation of labor. Step 9, I've just added high entrance costs and high exit costs, because what you paid to get into the cult, and I don't mean money, I mean friendships lost, career, future, whatever it might be, is also part of the exit costs, if that makes sense. And then the last one is ends justifies the means. And my first rule, I have these 10 commandments for good groups that are not cults. And my first rule is don't rape the children. And this one's very applicable for Mormons, right? And people do that, but I'm like, but how many times in society do we see this? And I think it is the epitome of ends justifies the means. To like, it's always going to get to that, because cult leaders are trying to get power ultimately, right? And if you can do the worst to children and walk away, you're very powerful. And then we see, right, the group end up supporting that, because ends justifies the means.
The group ends up supporting that, sometimes hundreds of years later, right? You have Mormons today, 200 years after Joseph Smith raped children, justifying his rape of children. Because
I see this in discussions of the Branch Davidians all the time. And in fact, I'm calling out liberals and conservatives on my comedy special, because they're like, oh, it was FBI overreach, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, he was raping children. Like, yes, there was government issues, but one, he perpetuated his own apocalypse, as cult leaders will often do. But two, like, he was raping children. He was a bad guy. And people still defend it.
I remember watching Waco. I think there was I can't remember what channel it was on, but there was like a mini series about it. And it was so chilling, because it reminded me so much of my childhood. And the only difference in my mind was the government never showed up at my door.
Yeah.
Right. The FBI never showed up. But had they, we were ready. Like we were talking about earlier, soldiers, right? I grew up anxious for that, actually. Like there wasn't a lot to do. And so I was pretty bored a lot. And I remember as a very young child almost fantasizing about, I hope this happens so that I get to do something interesting that I've been training for.
Yeah. And first of all, that's a really good description of why soldiers want to deploy to war. But what was I going to say? So I write about Waco in Uncultured, and like, because I'm 6 years old when it happens in 1993, and we are told all about it. I mean, like, I started having nightmares about screaming rabbits since then. And it was like, we're not a cult. Waco's a cult, but look what Americans do to cults. Actually, this chapter 3, is published in Rolling Stone magazine, because it really well shows how they're like programming the children. And it's so weird, but like, I didn't necessarily come away with a feeling of being horrified, because my life was just that bad. I was like, of course you have that, like, kind of, you want it to happen. And I think it's because we're just living this awful life, right? Like, our life, especially in the Children of God, like, our life was just constant torture, constant, I describe it as growing up in religious prison camps. And so it's like, and we're being taught to die, right? I was being taught that by 12 years old, I was going to be being burned to death as a martyr in the end time anyway, right? So I was just like, and I remember my family had feeling just like, well, at least somebody came for them, you know? And children of God
Yeah.
spread out all over the world, and like nobody's coming for us.
I remember growing up, we had really tight restrictions on the movies we could watch, right? And especially as Mormons, right? You weren't allowed to watch rated R movies. But my family, I remember and I don't know how old, I was 10 or 11. And my family has a discussion where they're like, we should probably let our kids watch Braveheart. Because especially that scene at the end when Braveheart is being tortured, we need them to see that, because they're probably going to be tortured like that by evil people in the future who are going to get them to try to deny their testimony of Jesus Christ. So they need to be prepared for that. So I couldn't watch like James Bond or like American Pie, but I got to watch a torture movie because that was probably going to happen to me. And honestly, like I can say honestly that as a kid, when I was like, cool, at least something interesting will happen.
Yep.
Like at least we'll actually go do the thing that we've been saying that we're going to do, and not just sitting around.
Yeah. We had a book when you talk about like torture stuff. I mean, we had a book that was just like every martyr during the Inquisition, just like spelled out in grotesque detail. And of course I read it many a time because there was just nothing to read and I'm me. And like, it's horrifying to think back to, right? Like, and this is part of what we call religious trauma, right? Like growing up being told all of this stuff, like is in itself traumatic. Aside from, additional trauma.
Aside from all the other stuff, aside from the trafficking and the abuse and all of the other things, there's also this mindset that you're raised in of the world is about to end. We're surrounded by dangerous people, and also you have to be so careful of yourself and your own body because that's also evil. So you're surrounded on all sides by these enemies, and it does create a certain kind of human. You kind of described it earlier before we started recording as like an apocalypse child. Talk a little bit about what's an apocalypse child? What is...
Okay, but first of all, I want to say that there is a term for what you're describing with children, right? People would call it brainwashing, but brainwashing is on adults. Adults buy into their own indoctrination. It's a whole different process. Children can't necessarily be brainwashed in the same way because they don't have this level of thinking yet. But when a child is raised isolated under one, traumatic belief system, that's called mind rape. And like, that's how much of a abuse it is, right? I mean, it's really, really intense. And then, so my thing with the apocalypse child, again, I'm 2 years old on the cover of my book, Uncultured, dressed in armor as a soldier for God. We played this game called Heaven's Girl. I mean, we had a magazine illustrated for children that had a scene of like her being gang raped, and she's supposed to be witnessing to her attackers about the Lord. Like that was what we read as children. So many Christian martyr stories. We had a song about how we're never going to get to be 25. It was, what am I going to do when I get to be 25? Will the world be something? Will I even be alive? We had another one. And by the way, the children filmed all of these in video because we were a big childhood entertainment child trafficking cult. We had a video called 20 Minutes to Go that was about like the atom bomb hitting. And it's just like, someone comes on television and is like, hey, 20 minutes, we're all done. And just like how you're going to sit there and love your family. And, it's all part of this like emotional evocation that cults do. You're supposed to be very like attitude policed and very quiet and somber all the time until they want the emotions, and then they crank those up. And, even like talking about apocalypse children, and we just talked about the kids at Waco. And this is always something I like to say around Mormonism, but like when young children are sitting quietly for hours, it's not because they're well behaved. It's because they're being abused. Ruby Frank.
It's because they're scared.
Yes. And in
Oh,
so
and
in the accounts of Waco, right, are the FBI agents being like, wow, these children are so well behaved. They'll sit for hours in the middle of the night just listening to David preach. Like, that's not well behaved. Those kids are being
I,
abused and probably tortured, and they are terrified. It's
yeah,
actually something I
I
remind my husband about all of the time because we are raising a very strong child. And I'm always like, hey, she doesn't even have a setting where she's terrified of us. And that's why we can't give her and just make her behave.
right, and also like I children are supposed to misbehave.
Right.
Like that's they're programmed to be messy and to break shit. They're the research and development of our species. And so anytime I agree with that. Anytime you see a child that's super well behaved, I'm always like, I always want to kind of get down on them and be like, it's okay. It's okay. Be messy, break
Yep.
some shit, do
Yep.
some wild stuff. Because kids are supposed to be a little bit unruly and kind of wild and crazy.
Yeah, and this gets us to delayed adolescence also. But I want to say, like, because I always like to bring AA in as an example. Like, I have heard from so many children who grew up with parents in AA that sound very similar to my life, where it's like they couldn't do anything. They couldn't ever just be kids because then they would
Mm-hmm.
make mom drink, and that was the monster, you know? And so what happens when we get out of our cults, veterans have this, we saw Prince Harry having this, is, delayed adolescence. Like, you can't just skip childhood. You can't just
Yeah.
skip being a teen. When you skip being a teenager, even just because you're in another country, Mormons, you don't understand the culture, because like what you said about children, like that's what your middle school and your high school years are for, is pressing against the boundaries and like figuring out what is tolerated, what isn't tolerated, like where's your place in this big group called our society.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know how to do any of that when we get out of cults. And so we have to we just act like adolescents in many ways. Sometimes we're kind of trash people because we like lost the whole framework for our lives. And now we're like trying to figure out a new one.
You've just described like the last 3 years of my life. Cause I left the cult in stages. Right. And it took me a while, but once I was fully out and fully free, I sort of had, I don't know where this came from. I think I just kind of intuitively knew that I was severely underdeveloped. I was like, I think that I don't know if I could put an age on it, but it felt like I was like, in some ways I was like 6, in some ways I was like 14. Like I felt like I was just this unexpressed child.
Yeah.
And I sort of knew, I was like, I'm just going to have to do stuff. Like, I'm just going to have to like go out and kind of give myself permission to be a teenager as a 30-year-old man, because I have to kind of get that. It's not even that I have to get it out of my system. It's that I have to sort of practice expressing who I am, and then I call it finding the edges, right? Seeing how that bumps up into other people, how it bumps into society, who I am, what I've found. And I think this is really actually important for anyone who leaves a cult. And I think for me, especially, it's in Mormons, right? So I'm sort of really focused on the Mormon people. Those are my people. And I want to help them kind of bridge the gap between their Mormon life and then the life in the outside world. And I really think an important step in that is sort of embracing and intentionally choosing to have a delayed adolescence.
Yep.
Because you don't know who you are otherwise.
Exactly. See, and you see this painting behind me? That's the
I
piece
actually
of
noticed
art
that when you
I
first
did about my sort of delayed adolescence. And, so I get out of the Children of God when I'm 15, like almost 16, right? I don't know how to be a teenager. I kind of know how to be an adult. I definitely don't know how to be a child. And it's terrifying, right? Because you don't fit. And that's what like the cult was always telling you. And then going just real quick back to the apocalypse child thing, like even after we're out of the cult and we've rejected that entire framework, a lot of times we are still in this apocalypse mindset because that's how we were programmed, right? So we're still always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And that can be like
Mm-hmm.
really, really hard to get past. But I think what you said about like just understanding that you don't know who you are. Cults give everyone a pseudo personality. That's why people are always walking around with that like cult glaze on their face, you know?
Right.
And
Or the cult
so
smile.
even adults, when they leave cults, they have to pull that off and figure out who they are, because they're changed now. But for children who we grew up with no personalities, right? We grew up with no self identity, no unconditional love, all of those things. And so it can be really, really challenging.
It's really challenging. And I've also found too that it's also kind of a beautiful gift, because there's this opportunity that you have to sort of explore yourself in a maybe a more intentional way, right? Where if, I mean, don't get me wrong, I think I would have loved to have a normal, whatever that is, a normal childhood and a normal teenagehood.
Absolutely.
It would have been cool to be a teenager when I was actually a teenager. But it has been really lovely to give myself permission to just let whatever kind of wild and crazy thing that's inside of me that wants to express, and then to find that I really like those parts of me, right? Like right after I left, I left Mormonism, I started doing therapy. I realized I was traumatized, so I found a trauma therapist, and I was doing all of this work. My body was shaking all of the time. And then I like just found a guitar and I started playing guitar. I started teaching myself guitar. I got a guitar teacher. I started writing songs. I started doing comedy. I love that you painted that. I think that doing something creative is such a beautiful way to find yourself.
Yeah.
And that's really what I've been able to do is find a person inside of me that I really love. Like I really love who I am. And it's thrilling to be able to do that. Cause for most of my life, I was taught that the person that I had to repress that person that wanted to come out of me was evil and bad. And I couldn't do it.
Exactly. And I mean, the art for me has been such a thing, right? I mean, in Uncultured, you see the moment where I break. And that's when I started like painting and doing art. And it wasn't until just like a few years ago when I realized I didn't have an identity. And at some point, my husband is bragging about my book to someone. And then he said, "Oh, and my wife's painting." And they were like, "Your wife paints?" And he just goes, "Yeah, my wife's an artist." And I never thought of myself that way. And then, you know, the more I went into it, I was like, I am so good at many kinds of art, but I cannot draw because drawing was dangerous, because you could just get in trouble for the subject of whatever you drew. And, you know, sure enough, when I was 12 and like keeping my stuff in secret, I was drawing like a naked woman tied to an altar with Satan standing over her. So like,
Hot.
that was the childhood I had.
Oh
God. One of my paintings, I called it "Till Death Do Us Part." And it's like two of those like Mexican skeletons, the Catarinas, like dressed up as a wedding, and then death is just, you know, the sickle like standing there
hanging out there. That's so
speaking
good.
About waiting for the other shoe to drop, right?
That's the thing I think that makes me the most kind of equal parts sad and angry at cults is the way that they take the amazing, beautiful creativity of every human soul. Like every human is just so brilliantly creative and artistic and fun. And they take that and they tell them that's bad. And you have to conform that multifaceted, brilliant personality into this thing that is not even remotely interesting. That's just so like you walk around Utah and you see the Mormon smile and the Mormon, and it's all exactly the same. It's boring. It's not interesting. And you know that underneath it is this wildly expressive, creative human being that's just been shut down.
Suppress it all. Yeah. And, you know, I mean, your number one job in a cult or a total institution of any kind is not to be an individual, right? You're not supposed to
Mm-hmm.
stand out. But, you know, as you were talking about, like, you know, we leave the cults. At first, we don't even realize we were in a cult, right? We realized we got out of something and we have to now try to survive in the world they told us was evil. And I don't know if you had this, but I had this where I was like so scared of people knowing that like you grew up in a cult, because I just had this idea that they would just like reject me. Like I used to have this dream that they would decide my high school diploma wasn't valid because I did it in 2 years. And then so everything else I'd accomplished, like I was already a captain in the army and I would have to like go back to high school, you know, and like do it all over again.
Yeah.
But let me tell you, oh, and I like lived in fear of pop culture references because, you know, I didn't get any of them. But literally, once I started just telling people I grew up in a cult, I'm like, that was honestly the biggest gift. Because, first of all, like Americans love teaching things and sharing their culture and talking about stuff. But also, like, nobody expects anything, right? Like, the thing that was actually killing me, speaking of shutting down your personality, was like I was trying to put myself into this box, I think, of just like skinny blonde white girl from Texas that
Mm-hmm.
I in no way fit in. And then I would be so frustrated that people didn't like the real me or couldn't see the real me, you know, and it really was like I had to let her out and stop. You
Yeah.
know, I just went from cult to super student to super soldier and then to super mom. And then I had to be like, stop, you know, who are you?
Yeah. I have found that because I agree. I have a similar that feels familiar, right? When I first leave, I'm like, I don't really want anyone to know. I don't want to be, I don't want to just be the weird polygamous kid, right? But as soon as I started talking about it, like especially talking about it, like I first started talking about it like at work. I'd like tell people like some stories, and they were just fascinated, interested. That also is what helped me learn that I needed to go to therapy. Is I would tell stories that I thought were funny,
And people would
and
be
they would be
horrified.
like,
Yeah.
they're like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "No, this is a joke, you guys. I mean, it really happened, but isn't it funny?"
That's going to be in my
But yeah,
comedy special for
I found
sure.
that everyone's really lovely. Everyone's Americans are fascinated by cults, and especially kind of, you know, again, pitching your comedy special that's coming out. As I started getting into stand-up comedy, that is a huge hook for me, right? So it's a great way to grab everyone's attention and then make it sort of, then I can do whatever I want with that
Yeah.
attention. And I've also been able, because I also live in fear. I used to live in fear of pop culture references until I realized that everyone loves being the first one to show
To show
you
you something.
Nirvana
Absolutely.
or
This is what I
so,
say.
and so,
Everybody loves being an expert, right? So when they get to teach
yeah,
you, like some of my most insanely viral Twitter threads was when I was writing Uncultured and I was just asking people for music advice to listen to because I learned like my brain needs to be a
yeah,
little bit distracted and I know nothing about music. And people were just so excited. You know, I'd ask everyone to share their favorite song and put it in a playlist. But you know, it occurs to me that this fear that we have, right? Because I have so many friends that are like, oh, I don't just want to be like the cult girl. You know, and I used to joke, like, I'm
mm-hmm,
just going to lean so far into it that I'm going to come out the other side. But I think
totally.
it's like that's not really how the world works. People don't just identify you as one thing. That's the way the cults work,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like we're
Oh,
worried that
you're
other
so
people
right.
are just going to put these labels on us. You know, and as you were talking, I was remembering when like Facebook came out and I was so surprised that everybody knew their friends' last names, like all of them, right? Because like I don't know any of the last names of any of these people I grew up with. I was finding it out as we were finding each other on Facebook. Because, you know, I mean, we weren't individuals. We didn't need last names, you know, I mean,
Right.
and so all of that, right? Like all of my friends, people that know me in real life, of course, know that I work obsessively on cult stuff. but that they don't identify me as like, oh, she's the cult girl, right? I'm just Daniella. We all have pasts, and sometimes they get mad at me because I always have the most extreme stories, but I compare it
That
to
is
Phoebe in Friends, right? Like, we are all so worried that our friend groups are going to reject us if we go through the process of figuring out who we really are. But I'm like, but everybody knows about Phoebe's trauma, and she's definitely quirky, but they love her anyway, right? Like, she has a solid group of friends.
Yeah. Yeah. I love too that epiphany is so powerful that fear of rejection, that feel of being only one thing, that's our cult brain, right? That's where that comes from, because out in the real world with all of its problems, people are sort of allowed to be a bunch of different things. You have a bunch of different interests. You're more than just your relationships. You're more than just your religion. You're more than just your hobbies. You're all of those things. And
this is something so interesting, because I always say I'm from nowhere. Like, I don't have a hometown. My therapist just told me yesterday, like, I think you're from the internet. And I've been thinking about that. But what you're saying, like, I first learned this on Twitter, and then TikTok has been really good for me, because you can't be all things, right? Like, you're the multifaceted, right? So when I used to like meet people and try to introduce myself, you can't, right? It's too strange. It's too complicated. But in 160 characters, like, sometimes I'm just army wife. Sometimes I'm just mom. Sometimes I'm just girl obsessed with Alice in Wonderland, right? Sometimes I'm just crafter. Sometimes I'm artist. And so social media has really allowed me to like develop all of those parts of myself and be like, I don't just have to be cult lady, right? I can be all of these things. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and I can really own that. I've been able to sort of reintegrate that cult personality back in and be like, that's who I am, but it's also not all I am, right? And that's fun. It's fun to be able to own that part of myself, and to have access to that part of myself, and also be able to be other things.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and that's part of
I
it.
feel like
I just tell people, like, my thing is like, wear wacky outfits, right? Because in every cult, you are under both attitude control and appearance control, right? Like, it can be all kinds of appearance control, but remember, you're not supposed to stand out. And actually, this is one of my collars that I make out of crochet. And I call them the dissent collars, because like, cults want you not to be unique. And we are like, no. I actually do all this clothes design. I call it a scarfigan. I take a scarf and I turn it into a cardigan. And
that's so great.
I buy clothes at thrift stores and chop them up and add yarn. I call them my reconstruction deconstructions. But any kind of wacky outfit works. And it's funny because we have kind of a parallel to this in the queer community. That like, the first time you go out dressed just like, flamboyant in any way, I'm back to us now, right? Like, just wearing something that would absolutely not be acceptable, right? I know for Mormons, it's like showing your shoulders,
Well, for me, it was my elbows, right? like this is pornographic right here.
Yeah.
I feel that so hard. The finding clothes and using clothes as a way of self-expression has been so much fun.
Oh, yeah.
And it's also, and it really has felt like a reclamation of myself, because the clothing was so controlled, right? You could only wear this, right? It had to be a certain length. You had to have stuff underneath it.
And this is why I like it as a deconstruction tool, right? Because it reinforces subconsciously, like, you belong to you. You are, everyone's afraid of someone being like, what? Why are you wearing this? Like, because I want to, like, it probably took 3 years for my new community to like understand, like, I am going to be wearing whatever I want. Like, I'm going to wear a full beaded rainbow crochet gown to, casual gathering. Like, I don't care. I am. And actually, it was very interesting because when I got my book deal, which was, you know, the most money I'd seen together in my life and put me into a place where I didn't have to work for a while. Anyway, so my first thought after gaining like financial freedom was, I'm going to wear whatever I want for the rest of my life. I'm going to be an author now. I'm wearing whatever I want for the rest of my life. And it's this really important moment, right? Children are learning this when they're 4 and 5 and they're picking out their clothes, you know, and we didn't get to do that. We always had to be these little clones. And everyone thinks cults have uniforms, but it's not uniforms. It's a uniform appearance. Right. Yep. And so just, you know, I love thrift stores for this reason, because like I fell right into 2003 mall culture and it was awful. But I feel like malls are, first of all, it's one snapshot in time of the culture. And it's always messaging to you what you like. Right. Whereas you walk into a thrift store and I have this one just rainbow blazer that is so brilliant. And I was like, I walked up to it and I was like, do I love this or do I hate this? You know, and I decided on love and I bought it. And it was like, you are making this decision all by yourself. And then you're going to have to go walk out in the world and get feedback. And that's scary, but it's also very exhilarating.
It's very exhilarating. And not only are you going to get feedback, but you'll get feedback. And if you want to, you can ignore that feedback.
Exactly.
That's been something fun for me because I've been growing my hair out because for men, right, short hair in Mormonism, that's the thing. So I've been growing my hair out for like a year and a half, and it just barely popped where I can now do like two little pigtails nice. Like that. I love pigtails. They're it's so fun, and I'll get on stage with these. Amazing. I'll go outside and have them. And everyone, they'll see me and they're like, this is a grown ass man with pigtails. What? There's like a double take. And then, but I'm just like, this is me. I got it. And then they're like, oh, this is kind of cool. And then I get complimented, especially from old ladies all the time. It's my favorite.
You should try space buns. Maybe your hair has to get a little longer for that. I recently added like two buns to my, hair repertoire. Just like on top. Yep.
So I would do
like higher than Princess Leia buns. They're just like Mickey Mouse ears, basically.
Oh, like, yes, totally. I could totally do that.
And people love it. You know, I saw this woman on a show wearing it. She was much younger than me. I was like, I don't care. I'm doing it. Like, I'm enjoying the aging and the grays, but I'm also going to like pop with my space buns. And
I could totally do like a little thing like that. There we go. See?
And by the way, while we are talking about hair and appearance control, right? It's a big part of it. So you got appearance control, I find always breaks into 4 categories. It's hair, body size, body coverage, and underwear, which includes socks and pantyhose. And when you say you get like the old lady compliments, mine is Black women. Like I dress very colorfully and creatively, and I get compliments from Black women, and I am just so, you know, like it just makes me so happy. I don't look like the cult skinny white woman anymore, right? Like I am not that. That's also it's like my clothes are also the message, right? Because what happened to me was I left the cult. I landed in Texas. I'm trying so hard to fit in that I'm basically like putting on this overlay of like WASP, right? And like married to awful man, all of this stuff. And it's like that, even though that's what I look like that is just as foreign to me as any other just random identity that I would pick. And it's also a really boring one. And so it was like, I'm not doing that. And like the way I dress right now, like regardless of my face, like nobody thinks like I'm this nice, quiet Christian girl from Texas. Like they understand. I almost think like sometimes I'm just messaging that I'm like not in the white supremacy cult anymore. I'm not going to be quiet. Like, I'm not going to be skinny. I'm not going to be a light shade of beige. I'm going to be whatever I want.
I love it. When I look at that collar, do you know the significance of the collar and the Mormon garment?
No.
Okay, so this will be interesting for you. So and it varies, right? So the Mormon garment is different. It's changed a lot. It used to be for the LDS church, it used to be like a full body. That's what the polygamous version still have, is like a full body, what Joseph Smith put on, which is like down to your wrist, down to your ankles. The LDS, they've made it like t-shirts and shorts. But it's still like super, it's especially bad for women. It gives them UTIs because it's underwear designed by men for women. It's shit. But all of them have a collar, right? A little collar that goes around. And for the polygamous versions, it's a big, thick white collar that kind of goes all the way around. For the LDS, it's like this short little lace collar for the women and a short little collar for the men. But it literally represents being yoked, right? Like being yoked like an ox for Jesus, right?
In the
And so
children of
I
God, we would
love
actually wear yokes, like yoke earrings, or that was like the only kind of jewelry you could get away with was if it had a yoke on it.
Wow. I love that you've taken that and that you've turned it into this
like this
fabulous
is exactly
expression
the opposite of like the Mormon collar.
Exactly the opposite. It's like the yoke. It's like I'll yoke myself with whatever the fuck I want.
Yep.
And today
You
it's
belong to
sparkly
yourself.
puffs.
I like how you said that. I'll yoke myself. Like you belong to yourself. And I always
I
tell my
belong to me.
audience too, like when you leave, you're jonesing for the mission, and it's okay for the mission to be you. Your life's mission can be you and your people having a good life. And this is actually, I do this kind of anti-mission mantra for myself because I do work in like a helping profession where I'm like, my mission in life is not end rape culture in the army. It's not end cults. It is for Tom, Daniella, and little Love Young to have a good life. That is my mission. These things are my job, but this is my mission. And I say the same thing with organizations, right? Where people are like, well, can we be a good cult or a good organization? I'm like, show me. My first question is, show me where the organization loses so that the individual can win. Because for a system to be valid, good and bad are not scientific terms, right? But for a system to be valid, it has to be self-sustaining. And if the individual is under constant self-sacrifice and self-sublimation, your system is not self-sustaining. It's not valid. Right? And I just don't see under capitalism, like organizations ever, they'll say they are putting the individual first, but I think it's very important to phrase it as, when does the organization lose so that the individual can win? And that's very important for kicking out predators, by the way. Like sometimes the organization has to lose face, kick out the predator in order for the predated upon individuals to win from that organization.
Yes. And that to me is, that's what that question is really what, because when I grew up polygamist in what was called the AUB, the Apostolic United Brethren. And then for about 5 years after I left that, I was in the LDS church. And what ultimately pushed me out of the LDS church was they for years they denied that Joseph Smith ever raped children. And then finally they had to admit it because of the internet. And when they did that, they published an essay, and it's still on their website. And it's an essay about Joseph Smith doing polygamy in Nauvoo and about how it's really okay because God commanded it. And in the essay, they say that, because they have to admit that Joseph Smith married teenagers. And so they say the youngest wife of Joseph Smith was Helen Mar Kimball, who was sealed to Joseph several months before her 15th birthday. And I remember reading that, and it was like a kick in the stomach, because I was like, how can you be a responsible organization that claims to care about the safety of children and the importance of families and not hold this obvious pedophile accountable, right? And it was just that they were not willing to let the organization take a reputational hit so that they could protect the real people who had been harmed.
And this, by the way, is two things. So this is ends justifies the means mentality, of course. But this is also called the deification of idiosyncrasy, which is our human desire to make excuses for the inexcusable actions of our charismatic leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And I have my 1, 2, 3 rules of cults, and my third rule, and I say this is where we are with Donald Trump, is even if he did it, doesn't mean he's guilty. And that very well describes the way that Mormons are with both Joseph Smith and
with
Brigham
Joseph
Young.
Smith and Brigham Young. And I mean, the leaders today, right? Even if he did it, he's still not guilty. Doesn't matter. That's wild.
Yep.
And
this,
I want
by the
to
way,
have
so in Children of God, right? I am the reason they went through the rebranding, right? Because when I was born to a 14-year-old impregnated by a 39-year-old, they were like, "Oh, she's proof." And so they married her after a teenager, did all this stuff, but and they try to say "Oh, we changed. Oh, we blah, blah, blah. Oh, we kick people out for this." That man, that 39-year-old man, my father, who's older than my grandfather, he died still in the leadership. It can't be both.
Right.
It's either
right.
wrong.
You can't
and he should not
hold
be
people
a leader,
accountable,
or you support his actions. It cannot be both.
You can't get to do, 100%.
And this, by the
we
way,
are
very
coming
much
up
applies to the U.S. military.
Yeah, I would imagine. We're coming up on our hour, and I want to make sure that we do what I feel is probably going to be one of the most important things that we do in this conversation, which is you have a rap for me.
I do, yes. So, since this is the Apocalypse podcast, and I describe us as apocalypse children. Well, we had this whole book of Bible verses we had to memorize. And by the way, I'm 10 years old here.
So you memorized thousands of scriptures at age 10.
Thousands of scriptures. When we got to the end time verses, which are very difficult language and concepts for young children, we're struggling. We have this African-American uncle who is our teacher. And so we put together this rap. And then, of course, the child exploitation people showed up and filmed it for, distribution to our entire 10,000 person army of God. So yes, here is me and 5 other white children rapping apocalypse Bible verses in downtown Rio. And I used to, when I was a captain in the army, I used to show this to my soldiers and then be like, I mean real cult.
I'm so excited for this.
fake. Don't be deceived, false prophets you rise. Many will believe to see wars, famine, earthquakes all around. Great tribulation before you hear the trumpet sound. Like a lightning flash across the sky, I'll appear and catch you up in the twinkling of an eye.
If you're sorry what happened, what's in store, even wrapping your feet, there are hundreds more. But don't be worried, don't be scared. Just be wise, open your eyes, memorize, and be prepared. I'll say that again. Just be wise, open your eyes, memorize, and be prepared.
Wow.
So I also always have to say, like, I, at the age of 10, wrote most of that dialogue, like all the parts that were not Bible verses, and I did not get credit for it, and I'm still bitter about it. But on a more serious note, right, this is what childhood exploitation looks like. And that boy didn't survive our childhood.
Oh man.
Anyway, you know, it takes a cost. What has been interesting is that since I've been like doing this stuff on TikTok, I have met people that were like, oh my God, we watched that growing up. Like, y'all religious people. And people have even said, I used to wonder how they got kids to like do that. And you know, I have a chapter about the filming in my...
I have a whole chapter about that in my book.
Well, in Un-American, which is my new project that I'm going to release soon, which is
I'm so excited for that.
Cult stories and army stories, but instead of focusing on group behavior, it's focusing on power, privilege, whiteness, otherness, and what it means to be un-American / un-American.
Ooh, I love that. Yeah. That video, it was hilarious first, and then it was a little chilling. And so like just looking at the title, right? Inspiration time, end time rap, family fun. Because what's more fun for your family than a little end time rap? A rap about the end of days. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I liked how you guys called him the 18.
You see, right? We are children chanting about dying in terrible ways. And
in
like
awful ways.
Smiling and bopping.
Right. You're bopping. You're the one with the piano on it. Yeah. The piano outfit, right?
Yeah.
You're just like crushing it. You're like having a great time. But what we're talking about is so it's weird because it's like your initial response is like, oh, that's kind of cute. Oh, that's kind of silly. But the more you, and then at the end too, it's like all of these terrible things we've described, this end time is coming. And what's the solution? Memorize Bible verses.
Yep.
That's the way out.
I mean, it was so, and then, you know, like even going into it further, like, of course, this was like exploitation writ large, but it was like, they took this little project that we did with our teachers to help us memorize something that we had to memorize. And then they made us do hundreds of hours of labor turning it into that. Where, of course, we would get beat for misbehaving, right?
Right. Yeah. And that's the dark underbelly, right? And that really is the dark underbelly, I think, of so much of, I mean, this is just from like the Nickelodeon stuff that just came out recently, right? But so much in America, and this is maybe a whole conversation for another show, is I grow up and I've just learned that I was labor trafficked like 3 years ago because I didn't have that language, right? I learned what that was and I was like, oh my God, that's what happened to me. And the more I talk about it, the more I realize that is not uncommon in the United States of America.
I mean,
the United States of America has been built on the backs of slave labor and female labor and child labor.
Yes. And I have a t-shirt company called Disrespectful T-shirts that I'll give you the link of for this show. I have a t-shirt that says America wasn't built to protect children. And by the way, the printer held it in review for 3 days. I mean, it just is, right? So I think the Mormons are probably some of the biggest child traffickers in the world. And by the way, the
100%.
missionary deployments where they hold their passports, that's in the international definition of trafficking. If an organization is holding your passport and you are of an age to hold it yourself, you are being trafficked.
Yeah. And not only that,
There's
because
no
they're so
legitimate-
brilliant at it,
Yeah.
they've made it so that they not only are they getting all of this free labor from missionaries, 2 years of free labor to build their multinational corporation, to get tithing dollars. The missionaries are paying for it.
Yep.
So they are funding their own exploitation.
Yes. And by the way, in cult studies, we have something called identity breaking indoctrination, right? This is when you're first brought into the cult, or this is basic training in the US Army. My chapter on basic training is called Drink the Kool-Aid. And as children grow up in the cults, they realize that they have to identity break the children, right? Because growing up like that is different. This is where the Troubled Teen Institute comes in, right? This is what they're doing. And the Mormons themselves compare the missionary trip to military basic training and say that your most important convert is yourself. So I'm not even the bad guy here. I'm just putting it in the book and showing, like, here's the basic training parallel to the cult, and here are the Mormons comparing themselves to basic training.
They love it, right? They'll say that the mission, they'll be like, your mission is the hardest thing you'll ever do. It's the best thing you'll ever do. They'll intentionally, it's wild. And then they've done some things to change it, but they used to, like, up until like a year or two ago, you were denied you could have like a phone call with your family, maybe once a week, if that.
Yeah.
So you're
I heard at
totally
one point
isolated.
It was twice a year. It was on Mother's Day and on Christmas.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, this is what they do in basic training. Insane. They take your phones and they let you call home once or twice. And part of that, by the way, so in basic training, when they do this, part of this is to let you know that we own you. And so one of the things they do in basic training is in the first like 3 weeks, because that's about how long it takes. Once you get your basic training address, send out a letter and get a letter in return. You've been there for 2 to 3 weeks. And so they tell you some celebrity is dead. So when my husband went through, it was J-Lo. And it takes you that long to find out that it's not true. So I promise you that when my drill sergeant came in crying, saying that Michael Jackson was dead, I could not be made to believe it. Because I already knew this was like a trick that they used. Anyways, turns out it was real. But it worked the same way. It worked the same way.
Yeah.
We were still not able to get verification. And that subconsciously teaches you, like, you have to rely on Daddy Drill Sergeant or, you know, Daddy Mormon Church for everything you need, because you're cut off.
Yep. Daddy Bishop, Daddy Mission President. Oh, it's so gross. I'm so glad that you're out here, not doing your mission, because your mission is to give yourself an awesome life, but doing the work of educating people about cults. That's rad. We do have to wrap up pretty soon, but you have an apocalypse skill that you bragged on pretty hard.
So we didn't talk much about the apocalypse. We did in our pre-show, but I just want to touch real quickly on one of the themes that we talked about, which was there are a lot of us out in the world, a lot of cult kids, so many cult kids. And if you don't think you're one, but you read Uncultured and you relate, you were probably one.
You probably are.
And the good thing is, like, so we see cults pop up in times of social turmoil. And what we're going through right now is definitely a time of social turmoil. We're pulling down systems. We're coming up with new ones. Maybe we will have some kind of actual apocalypse, but maybe that's just our cult baby minds. But we have a lot of skills, right, for this. We are good with a mission. We are good with working hard. We are very creative. You know, we never say never. But this can also lead us into like more cults, right? So that's just something I always want people to notice, that the important part of doing your deconstruction is like finding your own identity, but also finding out what impacts the cult had on your personality and identity. Because once you realize that, right, like I'm jonesing for a mission, cool, you can go pick a better mission, you know, instead of like going headlong into another cult. So I do have the coolest apocalypse skill ever. I spent a really long time thinking about it. I mean, one of mine is just storyteller, right? And especially in apocalypse, do we need the storyteller? But okay, so I mentioned I broke down, right? Like I tried to run from my trauma for 10 years, became a captain in the army, completely broke. I won a marathon, and 2.5 months later, I'm being evacuated for something we think is a very, very serious thing, potentially fatal. And one of my symptoms is that I was lactating and I had no baby. Yeah. So it's, you know, turns out it's like a hormone thing, but they couldn't figure it out. I eventually, you know, I just think it was my big cult break. I recovered. I had a baby. I produced so much milk. I fed 7 other babies.
Whoa.
And I'm still, my child is 8, not lactating. Because the only way they stop that is by giving you a pill that lowers your prolactin. But I don't have that. So I think that in the apocalypse, I'm just like a little baby feeder and child feeder even, right? Because, you know, feeding kids up to 4 breast milk throughout the non-developed world helps children's mortality not be that low. So yeah, that's my cool apocalypse skill. And I bet you've never heard anything like that.
I've never heard anything like that. And I'm so excited to have you on my apocalypse team, because we are going to need to feed lots of babies to rebuild the world. And now we can have cheese and ice cream.
And sunscreen. Breast milk makes very good sunscreen. And also it helps heal wounds. You put it in your eye when you have an infection and the infection will be gone. I mean, it's crazy.
It really is. It's like the nectar of the gods.
When the kid you're feeding is sick, it changes so that it gives the kid what it needs. And when you're feeding, like breastfeeding like a 2-year-old and a newborn, it produces newborn specific milk, not 2-year-old milk. Like it's crazy.
Wow.
There are also whole like breastfeeding cults, and La Leche League might be a little bit cult-like.
Look, I've been
it's a good apocalypse skill to have, you know.
I've been in enough cults run by men that I would give a breastfeeding cult a try. I'd at least check them out.
All the ones I've seen are still mostly run by men, though.
Damn it.
Herein lies the problem. You know, this is an interesting topic, right? Just here at the end, because people are always like, why are they always men? And of course they're not. There are many women cult leaders, and there are definitely many heads of like narcissist heads of families that are women. But I think the reason is because coercive control plots very closely along a patriarchal line, which 1 means it always hurts the women and children, and 2 means that a woman has to work that much harder, right? And you see this with me in the army. As a woman leader in the military, I have to work that much harder, and when I fall, it will be so much more celebrated. Right? Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos, or even Marissa Meyer of Yahoo, right? Because that woman stepped out of line. And trust me, there's a whole chapter in my next book called The Skinny White Woman, and we get into all of this. And it's also fun now when people on social media are like, why she gotta be white? I'm like, let me read you 25 pages of research that I've done.
That's because what white women are doing. It's also interesting too, like not only not only all of that, but also, especially in Mormonism is the only thing that keeps Mormonism going is the free labor of Mormon women. Mormon women run everything in the local church, and like the men have the priesthood and like sit up on the stand and like are like in charge, but everything of substance and importance is happening because women are doing it.
Yeah.
And it makes me want to just like grab every Mormon woman and shake her and just be like,
Yeah.
stop.
But also,
Just
isn't
stop
that kind
giving
of
your labor
true?
away.
Isn't that kind of true of society, of American society
100%.
also? Like there was someone who got very famous. I don't remember her name, but her tweet was, it was during COVID, I think. And it was like, other countries have social programs. America has women.
Right.
And this is actually one of the things that I've found in my own deconstruction is that everything that I'm struggling with going through deprogramming from, because I was raised in a cult, either all millennials are going through or all white millennials are going through. You know, like we are all being pushed out of the cult of white supremacy right now or leaving it by choice. And like it is coming
100%.
down. And I always like to tell people that one of the things that cults gives people is a feeling of superiority. And I think that this is what a lot of the like angry white man trend going on in America is. And for white women too, for sure. It's like, what's going to make me special? And the answer is nothing. Nothing.
Nothing will make you special except you.
You're special you're
yourself.
Special as an individual human, but you're not any more special than anyone else on the planet.
Yeah.
And
let that go.
One of the things that's really hard to get over. And in my book, there's a moment when somebody tells me that a lot more harshly because we're soldiers, and it's get the F over yourself. You're not as different as you think you are. And that is what I tell people all the time now, that like your cult experience, while it didn't meet the average American experience, wasn't different than any other cult experience. It is all programmatic. It is all coercive control. And understanding that is one of the things that is going to help us build connection with, not only fellow survivors, but all them systemites out in the real world too.
Yeah, and there are literally millions of us.
Yes.
There are millions of us who all had the same experience, and the individual details might have been a little bit different, but the broad swaths of what we experienced is the same. We're not that unique. We're not that special. And I've found, like, at first, when I first realized that it did make me feel sad and small. I was like, but I want to be special. But it's actually, as I've sort of sat with that, I've actually felt like a really profound sense of relief that I don't have to be the chosen one.
Exactly.
This is not all up to me. I don't have to fix everything.
No.
I get to just kind of be, like you said, kind of focus on my world and be me and try to build the best life that I can for me, and then do what delights me in the world that ultimately does, I think, have a positive impact and will make the world better. But I don't have to save the world, which is great because I can't. I'm just a teeny tiny little cult baby.
Yeah.
From
and
Wyoming.
That's the real impact of growing up the apocalypse child, right? Is that we feel like we have to save the world. And, it's this process, I call it becoming less narcissistic, but more selfish. Like, because cults give you that sense of narcissism, right? I'm so special. This sacrifice makes me special. These works make me special. But we don't know a single thing about self-care or what we really want or, following our own passions in life. And I think that because mission, community, and purpose are things that all people look for, we cult babies don't realize that we have those dialed up to 1,000. And so we see people really struggling for community, but what they're looking for is an overly enmeshed, unhealthy community in the first place. And part of what we have to do is like demissionize, right? And just like your purpose can be small, your mission can be you. You do not have to spend your life trying to change the world. If you do, awesome. Yes. But that little burden that you were given when you were born Like, you can put that down. You don't have to keep
Yeah.
holding that duffel bag up in the sky, which is a reference to the
Right.
prologue
It is
of my
not
book.
your job. It is not your job. I love that. That is such a great, I think it's such a relief to understand that. And then what you get to do is then inhabit your own life. And I think that, because I think that we do need changes in the world, right? The world does need to change and heal,
Right.
but that's only going to happen when people inhabit their own lives and begin to sort of care for their immediate surroundings, right? Where they are right now.
Yeah. And so, like, oh God, what were you just saying? Sorry. What did you just say?
Just that setting that burden down is a relief, and then it allows you to sort of drop into your own life and live your own life. And I think that the way that the world changes is by millions of people letting go of those big missions and just inhabiting their own lives.
100%. And, cult studies have found 2 reasons that people are like open to getting conned by a cult. And one of them is being a seeker, which, like you were saying about like healing, and being a seeker is not a bad thing, right? Like, our systems are broken. Our world is going through a ton of conflict, right? Like, we are asking and trying to answer really important questions. But the other one is lack of social connections, right? And so the more, what was happening with me was I was telling myself I was so different, right? Like, oh, of course I'm traumatized. I grew up in a cult. Of course nobody can understand me. I grew up in a cult. And realizing, like, no, human beings can understand each other, right? Sometimes you have to learn how to tell your stories better, but we can all understand each other. And so the more you build community by inhabiting your own self and, being who you are in the world, that's going to make you less vulnerable to our tendencies to be seekers leading us into negative groups.
Yeah. And the more and the more healthy groups we start to build, right? Because you're building community and groups from this place of healed, not from this place of I'm empty, fill me up.
Yeah.
And enmesh myself with you.
And one little comedy point before we go, like, if you describe yourself as growing up in something, you were probably in a cult. When I say I grew up in the Children of God. People say they grew up in Mormonism. When I didn't know the Salvation Army was a cult until I heard people saying, I grew up in the Salvation Army. I'll tell you everything you need to know. And we say this in the military. I grew up in the Army, talking about sort of being babies when you join and growing up. And they say it in AA too, of course. So just a fun little last one for you before we go.
That's a little hack for you listeners. If you're saying that you grew up in something, that something is probably a cult. Daniella, it has been such a lovely privilege to chat with you today. I feel so special that you came on my podcast. Are there any,
Look,
you finished the sleeve. You're
my new scarf.
Oh my God. Oh, that's going to be so great. I love it. Any final thoughts from you, or is there any projects you want to let people know about? Where can they follow you? What do you want people to know?
So please come follow me on YouTube. You can see my TED Talk and all of my stuff there. Easiest way is just type Knitting Cult Lady. I also have a big community on TikTok, which is inching toward 100K. I keep saying this weekend, but it keeps not happening. But when it hits 100K, I'm announcing my next project that I'm releasing, which is Un-American. I call it a mini memoir. Like, I wrote a second book after Uncultured. It just didn't get traditionally published. And so I'm going to put it out in non-book form. And I'm going to announce that soon. So come follow me on TikTok, or if you subscribe, you get it for free. And that's mostly me. I sell autographed copies of my book as well. And I'm on most social media at Group Behavior Gal or Knitting Cult Lady.
Hell yeah. Thanks so much for coming on. You're rad. And I'm so stoked that we were able to connect. Everybody stay safe out there, and we'll see you next week.